to the first webinar for CASN for 2019-2020. My name is Donna Martin, and I'm an Associate Professor and Associate Dean of Graduate Programs at the College of Nursing at the University of Manitoba. And so this is so exciting. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the concept of lunch and learn, where faculty members come together during their lunch hour, especially for those of you in Ontario, to share with one another projects that you're working on and to dialogue and discuss methodologies, successes, and challenges that we've encountered in our work. This webinar series is intended to serve as an inspiration and a networking opportunity, and I'm so happy to see that there's 15 participants now on there. And we're going to create a real collegial feel of the lunch and learn. In this first session, we'll hear from Dr. Bernice Downey. Dr. Downey is a woman of Ojibwe and Celtic heritage, a mother and a grandmother. She is a medical anthropologist with research interests in health, health literacy, and Indigenous traditional knowledge, and health research system reform for Indigenous populations. And I think a lot of us are very interested in that. Bernice is currently across the Well, great to hear. It's Donna again. I'm just going to get right into introducing Dr. Bernice Downey. Today's webinar is titled Odayimman, Heart Project, Knowledge Translation in an Indigenous Context, where Dr. Downey will share her program of research and how it has served to deepen the understanding about how Indigenous knowledge about well-being can help Indigenous women to understand and manage their heart illness. She's also going to share how these findings, giving voice to Indigenous women, can inform our work to educate health practitioners to become more culturally competent when working with Indigenous women with cardiovascular disease and stroke. After Dr. Downey's presentation, we'll have time for questions. To submit a question, please use the question and answer function on your screen. Once you've finished typing your question, please don't forget to hit send. I'll now turn the session over to Dr. Downey so we can begin. Dr. Downey.
Ani, hello everyone. Thank you to CASN and yourself, Donna, both for inviting me to participate on the webinar and for the introduction. Yes, we often do have technology issues. It's great to have this webinar format, but and now we have a bit of background. But anyway, so I'll get on with the presentation, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the Algonquin Nation, where CASN is situated, whose traditional and unceded territory it is situated on, and acknowledging that the land is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. The funders for the project, slide 2, is the Heart and Stroke Foundation, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and you can see the institutes there, the New Brunswick Health Research Foundation, and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. Next slide. So here's a little overview about our research team. And so Dana Hart is my research assistant. She's also an anthropologist. She's Mi'kmaq and settler Newfoundland roots. And I should also mention in my bio that I have been also a nurse for almost 40 years, but I returned to school to study medical anthropology to address the many structural barriers that I could identify along my career path, and so that's what how I situated my doctoral degree. We also have 3 community partners who you can see their logos there. On the left is the Odayimman Aboriginal Health Centre in Hamilton, Ontario. The centre is the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, who are about 35 minutes away from Hamilton on a small reserve, which is located in a very adjacent to the 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. And the 3rd community partner is the Lake St. Martin First Nations in Manitoba. Next slide. So you'll see the study objectives listed there. The primary goal of this program of research is to expand the body of knowledge regarding Indigenous women at risk of or living with cardiovascular disease and stroke. And so I'll talk a little bit more in more detail further into the presentation. But you can see there, objective number 2 is about educating healthcare providers about Indigenous and gender-based ways of working with Indigenous women with heart illness, and also about an Indigenous health literacy approach that can help them become more culturally competent. And the 3rd objective is to contribute this important information about women's experience to help inform policy development and hopefully clinical practice guidelines about this population group. Next slide. So this is just a quick schematic about some detail on the literature review. These are a number of the concepts that we needed to explore further. Some of the literature is robust. I think for the most part, however, we found that there is limited information. And in fact, the Heart and Stroke Foundation identified, and I'll talk more about the morbidity and mortality of Indigenous women with heart illness a little bit later in the presentation, but generally there's a dearth of information about this specific population group. So you can see we wanted to explore and draw from the literature on cultural safety, thinking about the training, Indigenous knowledge. We want to understand more about traditional practitioners
thoughts in this regard and what information patients are accessing about wellness and illness. We also dipped a little bit into health coaching. And there's not a whole lot on Indigenous health literacy out there, but there is information in terms of coaching as well. Storytelling is also an important concept, and I'll talk more about that in the presentation. Next slide. So this is a very busy little schematic that's divided into 3 parts. So you can see a yellow, generally a red section, and then a blue section. And so we've just wrapped up the first year of the project with the ethics submission and the partnership engagement. And so you see that yellow flower there on the left, the 4 hearts that identify McMaster and our 3 community partners. And so as I mentioned, the overall primary goal is to expand the body of knowledge related to Indigenous women who are at risk of or living with cardiovascular disease and stroke, and to understand how Indigenous knowledge or ways of knowing about well-being can assist Indigenous women with the self-management or personal agency of their cardiovascular disease or stroke illness. The Indigenous knowledge that we hope to gather will serve to strengthen cultural beliefs about the role of women within their families, communities, and nations, and contribute to their knowledge and ability to take charge and manage their own journeys of healing. A second important factor, our focus is on healthcare professionals, as I mentioned, who work with Indigenous women. Now, healthcare professionals are generally not adequately prepared to work with Indigenous populations, and the way that they provide health information to Indigenous women is often not done in a way that is sensitive to Indigenous people's cultural needs. In this country, we have had a fair amount of uptake now on the whole concept of cultural safety. There's excellent online training programs that are out there that are specifically targeted for healthcare professionals. One in particular is the SANYAS Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. It was developed in the West, led by Cheryl Ward, and in this province, in Ontario, we have a very robust online program that is in high demand, actually has a fairly lengthy waiting list now through SOHAC, which is an Aboriginal Health Access Centre based in London. So I'd encourage you, if you have not taken any cultural safety training yet, and you're interested to learn more about it, you can just Google Indigenous cultural safety, and those programs should pop up. If they don't and you would like more information, you can also email me directly. So health science curriculum is generally lacking in information for healthcare professionals' needs in their clinical practice to ensure that they're working with Indigenous populations in general in a culturally competent way. So here at McMaster, within the School of Nursing, for example, we're running a parallel strategic planning process to a faculty-wide strategic planning process that I'm leading in the Faculty of Health Science. And it's multi-pronged to address various aspects of various factors related to Indigenous health education. So we're looking at administrative barriers, Indigenous knowledge, education and curriculum, recruitment of faculty, research, and student support and services. And so, you know, we recognize that we're in this period of transition, but over and above all that, there's also the area of faculty leadership and support. So supporting existing faculty who we know have not received a lot of Indigenous health education in their curriculum is an important component. So the cultural safety training, working with them as needed as they're trying to make adjustments in their course, in their individual courses they're teaching or working with Indigenous students. It's a very fast-paced environment right now as everybody is trying to catch up and feeling like they don't have the tools to do that. So this is a little bit of a longer-term project, but essentially this research program is looking to educate healthcare practitioners about Indigenous and gender-based ways of working with women. And thirdly, it's also expected that this research will contribute important information about the sociocultural variables linked to how Indigenous women experience heart illness that hopefully will positively inform policy development and clinical guidelines, as I mentioned. We also hope it will contribute to the emerging Indigenous knowledge base that's being cultivated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers across the country. Okay, next slide. So this is a little bit about our community partnerships. So some of you out there in webinar land may have previously or currently engaged in research with Indigenous populations, or you're thinking about it. So we now, fortunately, have made a lot of headway into ethics work, development of protocols, understanding more about community partnership development. And you can see this reflected in policy documents such as the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, Chapter 9, which carefully lays out the history of building partnerships and relationships in the research realm. And also in the documents, wait, I'm having a moment. Primarily the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, but another Indigenous-specific area of literature is the First Nations OCAP documentation. So it's OCAP as in Peter, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And again, if you Google that, you will come to the First Nations Governance Committee website, which will talk about the history. And essentially, this area of policy development and a self-determining approach about research for First Nations people developed because of the feeling that they had been researched to death, but they were themselves in communities and individuals and families were not really benefiting directly from research processes. And so over the last 20 years, we've engaged in this process to ensure that the universities and individual researchers do work with us in a meaningful way, and that we benefit from the outcome. And so the activities in this project are aimed to facilitate and also explore what's known in Ojibwe language as chi kikadung, or knowledge sharing, towards the achievement of Nabwakawin, or wisdom, among their community members, and to increase and facilitate access and understanding of Ojibwe values, traditions, and beliefs about wellness. So you can see that in addition to that first section in working with co-applicants and making sure we have things aligned in oversight of the project, community research agreements, and so forth, but that we also are thinking about Indigenous-specific ways of methodologies. And so this is an exciting part of the project to me, in that we hope to understand, like, for example, we're engaging fluent Ojibwe speakers who can listen to the concepts that are being talked about in some of our activities and identify in the language what those concepts mean in Ojibwe language. Because often the nuance and the understanding of, for example, knowledge sharing is very different and captured in the language. And we hope to illuminate some of that understanding. And so essentially the partnerships are intended to support capacity and through the collaboration with and between communities. So with the Mississaugas of the Credit here in Ontario and Lake St. Martin in Manitoba, we hope in a traditional way from long ago that communities will share what they're learning, what they've established as success in working in this area of heart illness and promoting wellness and resiliency. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit when I describe one of the activities.
So essentially then, this is a community-based participatory research approach to partnership, and the community partner guides the co-creation of the research objectives and therefore ensures that it leads to community needs-based outcomes. So the next slide just identifies the first activity, which is that of the community member gatherings. Next slide. And so we just completed our first gathering activity with Lake St. Martin just earlier this week. And one of the key methodologies that we're employing here is we're trying to indigenize our methods, as mentioned, within a mainstream context that is in an early Indigenous research reform environment. Basically about maintaining cultural process and balancing research ethics review expectations. So we are promoting the concept of conversational or storytelling methods. An important factor to remember with community-driven research is that the methods and the goals need to be community-specific, and likewise, culturally appropriate methods are community-specific. And so there is an emerging literature about this. For example, Walker, Fredericks, and Anderson discuss a methodology that Indigenous Australian women they were working with identified as appropriate for them the concept of yarning. Yarning is a conversational process of sharing stories and knowledge creation identified by community members and found to be an appropriate method. And I sometimes share the little story that when I was working in community development and health promotion in Ottawa, actually, with one of the local Indigenous women's groups, I was trying to encourage women. At that time, I was working for a feminist addictions agency, and we were trying to recruit Indigenous women, and I was working with a grandmother's group. And when I went in with my flip charts and my handouts and stood up there like the expert know-it-all that I thought I was, it was a very flat kind of non-engagement. So I had to kind of, rethink my whole process, and I joined the grandmother's sewing circle, sat at the table, sewing along with them. Everybody's heads are bowed, looking at their work, and just generally started the conversation and telling a story about who I was, what I was trying to do, and the stories emerged. And the information that I needed to get across to them, I was able to do that. And it relied on me stepping back and working in a way that was familiar to them. And so in this time of reclamation and a resurgence of Indigenous-based self-determining scholarship, Indigenous researchers are exploring and shaping methods that are culturally relevant and that express the indigeneity of the people that they are working with. So our collaborative project then is using a self-determining approach to research co-creation buy-in with the community. And our research team has identified this circle process and storytelling methodologies as tools preferred by the community, with the goals of understanding that an Indigenous community collective perspective on perceptions of well-being and how traditional family and community roles have been impacted by colonization. The community becomes engaged in the project and reflects on traditional teachings and how women's roles have been impacted by colonization. Now, we also have to be careful here and not assume that everybody is thinking about traditional knowledge and ways of being. Many First Nations people are, their spiritual beliefs are Baptist or Christian or, Roman Catholic or whatever it may be. So we have to work with those individual community partners and the individuals who are participating and, ensure that we're not imposing a cookie-cutter approach or understanding of who they are. And as I mentioned, translating story concepts shared in storytelling circles into Indigenous language is an exciting aspect of the methodology. And so we hope to also to be able to illuminate some of these concepts in the final report. So the next slide is a collection of pictures from Dawson River and the Lake St. Martin in Manitoba. And I share this with you as my own little story about why I'm engaged in this work. And so these are pictures related to the picture that you see in the very center is my grandmother's marker stone in Dawson River. The picture on the left
is Dawson River, where the boats are launched. The picture on the far right is kind of the landscape of Lake St. Martin, and the picture on the bottom is of one of the Lake St. Martin grave sites. And so the reason why I share this is that 4 communities in Manitoba in this area were impacted in a very tragic way of forced evacuation due to intentional flooding by the provincial government. And that started happening in the 60s, but most recently in 2011, a major flood caused complete evacuation and a process over 7 years of negotiating with the government to rebuild in these communities. And so I have been engaged as, I didn't grow up in community, I grew up in an urban environment. But my mother, who was born in Lake St. Martin and raised in Dawson River, and who is actually now in advanced state of dementia in a long-term care facility here in Hamilton with me. But the connection to the land is so great that even in her advanced dementia, when I told her about the flooding, she immediately asked me what was going to happen to the grave in that area and wanted me to go to Winnipeg to see what was going on and to make sure that the graves were okay. And over the course of 7 years, other family members, I have an 80-year-old aunt who lived in a hotel room for 7 years in urban Winnipeg. And there are many stories connected to this tragedy, this preventable tragedy related to government-imposed rules, regulations, and policies that women and their families of these communities are enduring. And so I fully expect that the stories that we hear from Lake St. Martin will be connected to this. And so we have to understand that in the research, I may want them to really hone in on heart illness or traditional teachings about wellness. They're going to talk to me about the flood and the stress and the loss and the grief and the deaths that occurred. Over 174 mortalities have occurred during the time of recovering from this flooding situation, which is very high for this community. And so I just share that with you that, the context is not always really clear. We go in with a preconceived notion of what we want to study and what we might hear. But this is a community collective experience that is impacting people's general sense of well-being and, no doubt, Indigenous women's heart health. So the next slide identifies Indigenous women with cardiovascular disease and stroke, and that's about our individual interviews that we'll be doing. The next slide. So this just kind of hones in a little bit on the whole area of Indigenous women's heart health. And so the Heart and Stroke Foundation have advised that generally there is a gender gap between men and women in health promotion, diagnosis, treatment, and research, with women lagging behind in all areas, with 2/3 of clinical heart disease research focusing solely on men. For Indigenous women, this inequality is more severe because of many historic and present-day factors. Indigenous peoples experience higher rates of extreme poverty, poor access to health, education, healthy food, and clean water. So all of these social determinants of health, of course, are impacting these statistics. And so as a result of the long-reaching impact of discriminatory government policies, including residential schools and a 60 scoop, that all continue to impact Indigenous peoples across generations. Now, Indigenous women also die from heart disease at a younger age, on average, than non-Indigenous women. And the Heart and Stroke reported in 2018 that Indigenous women experience a 53% higher mortality rate due to coronary heart disease compared to non-Indigenous women in Canada. However, some studies have found the mortality rates from cardiovascular disease to be up to 76% higher for Indigenous women. Now, a 2012 study found that the relative risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to non-Indigenous cohort members was highest in the younger age groups and diminished with age.
for Indigenous peoples ages 25 to 34 years, the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease was 62% higher for Indigenous men and 217% higher for Indigenous women compared to the non-Indigenous counterparts. So this has clear implications for policy development that is focused on aging and cardiovascular disease, for example. Traditional roles of women as strong leaders in Indigenous societies have been altered due to cultural genocide, and this has created a rippling impact on family and community health and well-being. So this research program then aims to work in partnership with the three communities I described to learn from the knowledge and experience of Indigenous elders, traditional practitioners, and Indigenous women themselves, who are often not listened to in terms of what their needs, their specific needs are. And also organizational representatives who work with Indigenous women, educators, and researchers to develop an education program to train healthcare professionals and to contribute to the closure of this gap. Next slide. So you can see there the next heart shape is about our traditional practitioners. And so, next slide. So this next slide includes a video, a YouTube video link. And this is such a broad topic and can be a very dense topic. But I would encourage you, we'll be sharing the slides afterwards, to look up this YouTube link, which talks about Indigenous knowledge in the health context and in the scientific context. And so the dilemma here, as I describe it, is that Indigenous knowledge cannot be verified by scientific criteria, nor can science be adequately assessed according to the tenets of Indigenous knowledge. And so the pathway forward is really to explore the interface. And when I think about the work within the Faculty of Health Science, I usually report to people that this is the tall mountain to claim, or to climb. The claim to fame for McMaster Faculty of Health Science is the whole evidence-based practice notion, and you know, that's evident throughout. And so right now, healthcare practitioners are trained to, you know, that their practice and education is informed by evidence. But the question that I raise here and that other Indigenous scholars raise is, whose evidence are we using? And so implications for Indigenous populations is that Indigenous knowledge cannot be verified, always verified by scientific criteria. And then, as I mentioned, nor can science be adequately assessed according to Indigenous knowledge. So each is built on different philosophies, methodologies, and criteria. And so if you have 5 minutes, like this, I think this video, I think you need at least 20 minutes in to hear the context by the scholar Leroy Littlebear. So some of you may be familiar with him. He's an excellent storyteller, and he gets into some discussion and looking at the physics and the comparison to Indigenous knowledge. So it's very interesting, and it's easy to conceptualize, and but we wouldn't have time to go through all of that today. So I can get you to think about that, and perhaps if you have some time, you can continue. But again, this is the tall mountain to climb in health science, and I'll come back to this in another slide shortly. So next slide. So this is then a little bit about the healthcare provider. Next slide. So this is a slide about my doctoral research. So it's a little schematic that demonstrates the focus on healthcare practitioners. I'm using practitioners and providers interchangeably. I tend to use practitioners because it also acknowledges traditional practitioners in the community. So you can see there that this schematic is in the shape of a medicine wheel. Not all Indigenous groups aspire to this type of symbol. Haudenosaunee, for example, used the two-row wampum and would not engage in using a medicine wheel symbol. But for my purposes and because of my indigeneity, that this is what it represents.
So you can see the yellow circle on the right is looking at assessment, and it's an assessment process that both elders, traditional healers or practitioners, and healthcare providers all engage in this process. And so typically within a medicine wheel, you move around the wheel. You start in the eastern direction, which is the yellow, and you go into the southern direction. And in this case, it applies to the notion of engagement. And I see a healthcare practitioner role as being one of a cultural broker. And so I remind people and encourage them that you can be a leader in the area of Indigenous health or Indigenous health education within the context of an ally. And so that is working closely with Indigenous peoples, with your Indigenous scholars or researchers to advance the work. And I encourage them that you don't have to know everything there is to know about Indigenous peoples. I think one of the biggest barriers to individual engagement in the whole area of Indigenous health education is their fear of offending Indigenous people, fear of offending their Indigenous scholars, human rights, complaints, etc. And so people are now asking for toolkits, resources to support them in this work. And so just remember, you don't have to know everything there is to know about Indigenous knowledge, but do know a little bit about the people in your backyard. So if you're in charge or on a team that's creating curriculum, there will be some international and national learning objectives, but there will also be specific regional learning objectives that should come from through collaboration with your local Indigenous peoples. So you should know a little bit about the people in your own backyard is the point there. And so if we move around the wheel then, in this process, you can see that there's a dotted line across the center of the wheel. And so that connects the patient to the healthcare providers, the traditional healers, our practitioners, and the elders. Because here what we're emphasizing is that individual women, are also experts in what they're experiencing and the knowledge that they have. And we want to build their personal agency and include their information in consideration of their care. And so the premise here is moving around the wheel then, engaging and creating an Indigenous therapeutic relational space in the middle. So it's all about the relationships, building the trust, getting to know your clients and your students if it's from a teaching perspective, and hopefully empowering those women or these clients to achieve Nibwakawin, or spiritual wisdom and empowerment, which then helps them to increase their personal agency. And in this time of self-care management of chronic illness, for example, that becomes an extremely important element. So my premise is that, if we maintain the status quo where, the healthcare practitioner is the expert advising and directing the patient, that it perpetuates oppression. An oppressive dynamic does not build a relationship or build it much, much slower, and does not affect personal agency and self-determination in the same way. So that is about a 250-page dissertation in one slide, so I apologize for all that information, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're aiming for in the training of healthcare providers. Next slide, please. So this is about the activity of engaging women leaders. So the whole, we're all very familiar, with the media coverage and, kind of all of the pathology that you see representing or, showing what Indigenous peoples are struggling with. But we don't often focus in on, the resiliencies, the strength, and, those journeys of Indigenous peoples that, have been successful, who are experts in their field, and who have major contributions to make. And so we will be holding in year 2 a women's leadership event. And this event seeks to engage Indigenous organizations and Indigenous women leaders in health, politics, education, domestic violence, and advocacy to understand how Indigenous women have been impacted by colonization, gender-related oppression, and inequitable structural and systemic approach. But we also want to provide an opportunity for participants to share how they managed their experiences of marginalization and oppression and racism, and how it impacted their own perceptions of their well-being and their experiences of leadership. So what were the strengths that they drew on? Who were the mentors in their journeys, and who did they collaborate to get to where they are today and to achieve success in their specific field? And this becomes important both to shift the attitudes that some healthcare practitioners have about Indigenous women, and also to hopefully inform the development of a workshop for young Indigenous women to promote self-esteem, to promote healthy heart lifestyles, and that's another activity in the project. Next slide. So this slide speaks to, again, this broader gathering, and you can see that I've showcased there the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's recently released report, Reclaiming Power and Place. And so this is, I put it up there because there's such a connection to how Indigenous women have been treated in this country, and of course their own sense of personal empowerment and understanding about their health and well-being. And so the inquiry's final report reveals that persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQIA, which is looking at a broad diversity among Indigenous women. So the 2-volume report calls for transformative legal and social changes to resolve the crisis that has devastated Indigenous communities across the country. And that speaks to, of course, teachings that until a woman's heart is on the ground, a community has not been defeated. Indigenous women often are the leaders in their communities, in health, in social, and so in spite of all of it they endure, they also have great resiliency. And so this will be an opportunity to explore that further with women and others from organizations and so forth. So I encourage you, you can download this report if you Google Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, but there really is a lack of understanding about how this is all related to health and the need, and in this case, cardiovascular disease. Next slide. So in terms of health outcomes, this research program, we hope, will add to our understanding of women's heart health in 3 ways. We'll pay special attention to culture and gender to learn how Indigenous women understand their heart health and their current approaches to living a balanced life. We'll develop and test a culturally safe model of care delivery that will be used by healthcare practitioners to assess if it increases Indigenous women's well-being, heart health, and relationships with their healthcare providers. And this model will include both Indigenous and Western knowledge. I think that's important. In previous studies that I've done, we also want the best that Western healthcare has to offer. So if you're dealing with heart illness or stroke, yes, we do want that evidence-based science. But we also want to create space for those who wish to include traditional practitioners in their care model. Finally, we will measure if the new model of care enables healthcare practitioners to form more reciprocal and trusting relationships with their Indigenous patients, women, and whether their patients feel that their concerns have been addressed. As the ultimate goal of this research is to improve health outcomes for Indigenous women, we must also think about the future generations. And so, as I mentioned, to do this, we'll be developing a workshop for Indigenous girls related to gender positivity, well-being, cultural resiliency, and pride. And this activity will also serve to build awareness with the communities regarding positive, culturally relevant health promotion and preventative lifestyles for young women and girls. And so in the end, the next slide you'll see is the coming together activity. And this is essentially where we will bring all the 3 partners together to share the findings of the report, to hear from them and identify, shared successes or how they can benefit from what other partners have learned, etc. Next slide. And so I just put this slide up there because this is a CASN webinar after all, but it's important that in going forward that we understand what the current environment in nursing is about and how it supports Indigenous health education in general. And so, we have had a lot of partnership with CASN, with other groups like the Council of Ontario Universities, I forget what the P is, Programs of Nursing, who struck a post-TRC working group over the past few years to look more closely at the TRC recommendations and to, look carefully at what was happening in Ontario. So it does require these allies and different organizations to help bring this work forward and to collaborate with Indigenous nursing leadership as well. We also need to acknowledge that a fair amount of work is happening around the whole area of acknowledging and upholding Indigenous nurses who hold Indigenous nursing knowledge because of their own indigeneity. And this is an emerging area of interest for me and for others who, we've been trained in the Western, more traditional health science programs, just like everybody else. And so it's often not so much later in our careers that we begin to, in fact, that's why the Canadian Indigenous Nurses Association started, but it's not often until quite later that we begin to let go and look inward and understand how our indigeneity comes into play, but we all hold Indigenous knowledge that we bring to our practice. And so that's a very exciting area for me and for other Indigenous nurses. Next slide. And there also then, here's a slide on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So again, going forward, this is not a new concept. The TRC was informed by 25 years of work, both through the United Nations and through the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It's focused on action. There's very clear Article 24 calls on medical and nursing schools, to effect positive curriculum change and so forth. So, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is a guiding document. Next slide. And so here I've put up this, on the left you'll see is a document that was released by the Wellesley Institute that was co-authored by Dr. Janet Smiley, a Métis physician and researcher, and Dr. Billy Allen, an Indigenous social worker. And when this document was released by the Wellesley Institute, it was the most downloaded document in the history of the Institute. It was downloaded 5,000 times in 3 days. And I mention that because to me it was like a watershed moment. It was that both non-Indigenous and Indigenous healthcare practitioners were, acknowledging that racism, systemic racism exists in our healthcare system. And we didn't even have a lexicon for discussing that before. So I encourage you, it's free, you can download it from the Wellesley Institute. I would encourage you to share this, to read it and share it amongst your colleagues, because we have to acknowledge it's not enough to just understand what the theory of cultural safety is. We also have to, uphold the fact that racism and discrimination exists in the healthcare system, and in order to do something about it. And you can see on the right there is a picture of Linda Smith, who was a Maori researcher. So this was at a gathering in BC a couple of years ago. And so folks like the Indigenous Aboriginal Health Institute at CIHR and our Maori partners, Indigenous peoples around the world have been trying to effect systemic reform in research, so that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, so that we are able to truly benefit the communities and uphold their self-determining approach in research. Next slide. And so this essentially is my last slide, and I called it Completing the Circle, because again, it's not just Western scientific methods that we need to employ in research, but we need to also find that space to complete the circle, promote Indigenous-centered ways of doing research, and accept and uphold and hopefully engage in collaboration with
Indigenous researchers and communities to uphold Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. You know, right now I have 11 different projects that people have come to me to ask me to collaborate in their research. It's because what's reflected in our system now is the Tri-Council research funding bodies are now requesting that people look at Chapter 9 and integrate concepts into their research. We don't have enough of us to go around. So from CASN's perspective and education perspective, we need more Indigenous faculty. We need more non-Indigenous faculty to be educated so that they can become allies and champions until such a time that we have a complement cohort of Indigenous researchers to do this work. In the meantime, we don't want to burn out who we have, and so I hope that that's the message I can leave with webinar participants, is that if you are not already an ally, you can become one in this area, and there are lots of people who can help you if you're afraid of making a mistake. So I think I'll pause there, and the last slide is just, not just, but is my mother's hand holding, well, my first grandchild, my granddaughter, holding my mother's finger. And this to me represents the 7 generations, both behind and ahead, that we truly have to create change. Our educators are critically important so that we can generate healthy hearts for future generations. So Chi-miigwech, thank you very much, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Downey. It's Donna here. I haven't seen any questions that have been submitted, but there's been a lot of comments about your beautiful slides, and you so succinctly really captured the essence of relational practice and becoming more culturally competent. So I really want to thank you for that. And if there's anyone who has a question, if you could please forward it, that would be great. Dr. Downey, I have one question.
Yes.
I think that, you know, you did present some, I think Jacqueline commented these are crazy stats, and I commented huge inequities, especially when you look at cardiovascular disease among Indigenous women. Just wondering if you could comment about the resilience and the strength, and how, as educators and researchers, we can balance those, you know, really disheartening health inequities with the resilience and strength of Indigenous women.
Yes. Well, the how-to question is emerging, but I think, as you can see, we're starting to create a space for the dialogue with Indigenous women themselves, and so that takes time. But I often tell practitioners, you can start with trying to build that relationship with them by sharing a little bit about yourself, who you are and where you're from. And then, to encourage, to ask them the question of, is there anything you would like to tell me about your heritage, your cultural heritage, that can help me support you in this situation? And that, even if they don't answer, that opens the door to building that relationship. The first tall mountain to climb, I guess, in that practice situation is the trust building. And so as educators, ensuring that we have a curriculum that is inclusive of practice-oriented, the development of toolkits and an orientation to, building those skill sets that are a little bit beyond, therapeutic communication. And this applies to working with Indigenous students in the post-secondary school settings as well. But I think, we do know that some research is emerging around
cultural cohesiveness and resilience, for instance, against suicide for Indigenous youth. So Chandler and Lalone in BC worked with some First Nations communities to look at the high rates of youth suicide. And some of their findings reported women's leadership, cultural cohesion, returning to the teachings, community capacity building, and so forth. You can refer to the articles. Were a hedge against youth suicide. And so we do need more research in this area, but the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report also gives us a glimpse into what Indigenous women are saying that they need. They just are often not given the space to talk about it. So that was kind of a long answer, but I hope that kind of gives you an idea of where we need to go. I really thank you for the comment, Nicola, on the concept of cultural humility, and so that has come about on the shirt tails of the cultural safety training too, and we often don't have the numbers of Indigenous healthcare providers that we need, but the notion that the value of cultural humility and just being able to in the spirit of good allyship, have that humility in the relationship and not always have to be the expert goes such a long way to building the relationship. Yeah, where are your people from is another suggestion. When Indigenous people meet each other, along the path anywhere, that's often the first question that we ask each other. Where are you from? And that really speaks to, kind of the deeper issue of identity, land, tribal customs, and issues. It's such a huge open-ended question, but it is a custom that we're familiar with. And so non-Indigenous people can also use that as a way to open the conversation. So the question is, one of the questions that have been typed in is that there are many online programs for cultural competency, and you're wondering about something that is more generic for cultural competency, humility training. So perhaps what I can do, Julia, I can send a little briefing note that I have that has to do with cultural safety training. It is oriented to Ontario, but I think there would be some national-wide information there that other people might be able to take advantage of.
Yes, and Julia, I can share the link to the Manitoba Indigenous Cultural Safety online program. Amanda and the people from the Centennial College would like a copy of the slides, but I just wanted to let everyone know that the recording of this session will be made available on CASN's YouTube channel and circulated to you in the coming days, and you're free to share that link within your networks. I want to thank you again, Dr. Downey, and I want to thank everyone for participating today. CASN certainly hopes you'll consider attending future sessions this fall, winter, and spring of their Lunch and Learn series. And please visit CASN, search Lunch and Learn for more information.
Okay, well, thank you, Donna, for moderating, and again to CASN for inviting me to participate. I'm very excited about this research. It's just a dream to me that I'm able to do this at this late stage in my career, and that I'm able to work with my people's communities as well. And I should mention, that the SHIRK element of the funding was to directly support that I could return to Manitoba and work with my community. So again, Chi-miigwech, and good luck to everyone, and yeah, have a great day.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Bernice. It was a really rich presentation, and I'd be happy to share those resources, including a copy of the slides, to all of our listeners today. So look out for that.
Okay, then.
Okay.
Bye,
Everyone
Have
have
a
a
good
good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.